Welcome to everyone. Delighted to be able to once again come together with you around works of beauty and to also host a conversation with the artist Ipek Kotan and a dear friend, Robert Mowry, whose credentials are longer than I'm about to present, but was at Harvard for so many years and created an extraordinary collection primarily of Chinese and Korean works with some emphasis on ceramics. But I'm especially appreciative to Bob for his willingness to share in this conversation. And I've emphasized that both to Bob and to Ipek, that these are opportunities, I think, to share both information, but also enthusiasms and responses to rather wonderful works of art. The present exhibition of Ipek's works is called In Search of the Perfect. And I wanted to begin with a quote from Brother Thomas, which is usually my wont, which is consciousness of the beautiful will save the world. So the notion of having the privilege of the gallery as a resource for many people to access that notion that beauty itself can inform, if not save the world, and make our lives much more meaningful and much more wonderful. Those of you that eventually will get the visual tour of the gallery and the e-catalog of the collections will have a sense of, at least for me, this gallery is now filled with enormous joy. The combination of Ipek's work with Jerry Garston, who was a painter we represented until he passed in 1994, and to realize that art sometimes endures, and in this case, in a very positive way. So it's a very, very exciting moment to be together with you and to have this conversation. So to begin, I think we can start with the cover of the announcement, In Search of the Perfect, and invite any of you and all of you to be part of this conversation as we move along. Next slide, please. Ipek, do you want to talk just a little bit about you at work and how you got to this work?
Ceramics in general, let's see. The ceramics in general actually came out of a pretty deep depression. I was working in Istanbul at a real estate investment company, and my job was marketing and mainly communication. And it was a good job. Everything looked perfect on paper. Actually, I was making a decent living. Had nice office mates. A great boss, and nice home. I made a decent living, but there was this nagging feeling inside me that something was off. And I felt over the years I became more and more depressed, and literally I was wasting away. I actually, what started first as bulimia, it turned eventually into anorexia, and I weighed something like 90 something pounds. And I realized at some point, something needs to change. And I was working a lot, so I realized it's not, I love working, I love being productive, doing something with my life, but what I was doing wasn't really working. So I made a list of moments that made me happy, thinking if I can find the common denominator in these moments, throughout my life, then I could perhaps find a job, find an occupation that had more of these moments, so that even if I, worked a lot, I would simply have more happy moments or, peaceful moments. And by the end of my life, I'd be able to look back and say, okay, I was actually mainly happy. So this list I made over, I think, 3-4 weeks, and it was very random. Things like, touching my dog's ear and feeling the peach fuzz on her ears, or cutting a tomato with a sharp knife, or picking nail polish, or looking at a beautiful sunset, or from when I was a kid, making a sand castle in the sand. And just a lot of these moments had basically being in the moment, feeling things, thinking about colors, shapes, forms, textures. There was a lot of touching, shaping, and feeling. And then I realized, wait a minute, this is all being creative and like feeling things and touching, shaping, thinking about these things. So it sounds like it would be, art and design. And then I started to ask myself, well, okay, do I want to be selling art, or do I want to be a curator? Do I want to go back to school? And after all these, a lot of, soul searching and asking myself a lot of questions, I realized I wanted to work with, I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to actually study something that I really wanted to study, which was art and design. And then there were, of course, a lot of materials to choose from. So I realized I wanted to study and work with something that was a natural material. So it brought me to glass, metal, wood, and clay. And then I chose, I quit my job around that time and decided to sign up for summer school, a 6-week summer school at RISD, and signed up for metal smithing and ceramics. And ceramics was, it just took me to another universe, and I found peace and love and joy. And I remember the moments when I actually felt like, okay, this is it for me. When it was a Wednesday night and everybody was out, drinking with their friends. It was summer, and I was still in the studio that night at 10 o'clock, even though I didn't even have a lesson that day. And I was still throwing on the wheel the whole day and evening. And then this amazing feeling of calm washed over me, and I felt so peaceful. And then I felt like, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for, looking for my whole life. It just felt so right. I could feel it in every cell, and I started crying, and it just felt really cathartic. And it was like this moment where I felt like my heart, body, and soul finally aligns, with what I was doing. And it just felt like, this is it. I don't have to choose or look for it anymore. It chose me. Ceramics chose me.
That's rather lovely. I just wanted to let you know that I had marked one other quote from Brother Thomas, which I was going to introduce much later, but it seems now is the time. The routine of life holds us in the readiness for the events of the soul. And certainly what you just described was the moment for you when there was an epiphany for yourself, spiritually, personally, and emotionally, to engage with clay, and then to invest yourself totally in it, because it gave you so much back, which is really quite a wonderful time and space to have found yourself in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bob, you, for the most part, dealt with not many artists that were living, but here's an opportunity to sort of respond to the journey of a living artist, and just some of your thoughts about what Ipek just shared with us.
Excuse me. Yes, thank you, Bernie. As you mentioned, I'm a specialist in East Asian art, particularly Chinese and Korean, with a real focus on ceramics from those two cultures. And over the course of my career, I've handled literally hundreds of thousands of ceramics,
Right.
from the very finest in the Palace Museum in Beijing, Palace Museum in Taipei, to the mundane, to works that have been recovered in archaeological digs that are wonderful, but perhaps broken, and dealing with shards that are encrusted with dirt. So I have covered the entire range. But looking at Ipek ceramics, they're extraordinary. Not only are they beautiful, but they are technically accomplished at such a high level. They are absolute perfection. And some of the things that I would note with my background, particularly in Chinese ceramics and thinking about Chinese imperial porcelains, in most cases with Chinese ceramics, and probably most of the places around the world where potters glaze their ceramics, for the most part, they completely cover the underlying body. Whether it's a stoneware body or, in this case, a porcelain body. Of course, one sees the exposed body perhaps at the foot ring, and one senses the body looking through the glaze in those areas where the glaze is thin. But Ipek has perfected the white body not only as the structure for the ceramic piece, but one perceives the porcelain itself as part of the overall experience. So in many cases, the interior, or in so many of the pieces, the interior is glazed, but the exterior is left unglazed and then burnished so that it's so very soft to the touch. So this is somewhat revolutionary to glaze the interior of the pot. but to leave the exterior unglazed, but then finish the unglazed part so beautifully. And then another thing is that the walls of Ipek's pots are often very thick, as we see in the slide at the moment. And in a sense, because the wall is so thick, it adds another dimension. In later Chinese ceramics, in Ming or Qing porcelain, of course, the goal was always to create a very thin body. But in this case, the walls of Ipek's pots are quite thick. And in a sense, because the interior was glazed, the top of the rim is not, nor is the exterior, to some extent, the unglazed rim acts as a frame to showcase the beautiful glaze within. So these are things that, while it's porcelain, in that sense, it's a relative of the very finest Chinese porcelain and things like that. That is, the material is closely related. But the interpretation is quite different. And to see the goals that I look for in the very best Chinese ceramics, thin walls, fully glazed, to have that turned inside out, as it were, with Ipek ceramics. First of all, it was a surprise to see that. But as I looked at them, I realized what a happy surprise to explore something new, to do it completely differently. And so those would be my initial aesthetic reactions to Ipek's pots, the beautiful white porcelain buffed to a very smooth surface, the extraordinarily beautiful glaze, and the absolute technical and aesthetic perfection of the pieces.
Thanks, Bob, because I think that helps us when we get further into it and begin looking at and appreciating the works that she has created. In the next slide, which is a short video of your new studio, Ipek, you, I would think, have moved a few times and might want to talk about your journey physically from place to place in order to find the place for you to work and feel satisfied. Nice. It looks like a rather large space.
There is actually, it's 114 square meters. So I think that's a little bit over 1,100 square feet. It's a pretty big studio, but I've noticed that over the years, it's having actually more space is a good thing when you're trying to work with large pieces, especially with porcelain, mainly because the pieces, the bigger porcelain shrink. Well, let me start with this. Porcelain shrinks 20%, at least the porcelain that I use, Audrey Blackman, at the moment. So 20% is huge, and you have to. So that means if you want to have a piece this big, you actually have to make it this big because it shrinks a ton, a lot, 20%. One, there's that, and also you always have to make the piece a little bit bigger so that the way I work is, it's a little bit like sculpting. First, I give a very general shape to the piece. It's very coarse, you actually don't even see. You can look at it, you can see the general shape, but it actually needs to be, a lot needs to be removed. So if it takes me, for example, to make a piece 20 minutes, I may spend hours trimming it with various tools. One is a sure form, like a cheese grater tool, really like a Parmesan grater, and you grate firstly, a lot of the clay with that, and then I use a metal rib to actually shave off parts. So it's actually very similar to the way a sculptor might work with a piece of wood or rock. First there's the very crude shape, and then little by little you refine it more and more and more. And so that means it has to be actually really much bigger than what you see. And the other thing is the pieces need to dry for literally months. If they don't, they crack. That means if for example, for a show like this, if I want to have 10 big pieces, I really have to make at least 50 to 100, but really more like 50, so that I can actually factor the cracking, so that I can make sure even with the cracking I have enough pieces. Well, that means there has to be basically a room just for drying the pieces, because I put basically a box over the clear box over the pieces when they're drying, so I can. There's also a hygrometer which measures the moisture on the inside of the box, and the pieces dry little by little over months. So I mean, simply that means I need a lot of space so that I have enough room to dry the pieces and keep making other pieces in the meantime, and also teach. So yeah, I need a lot of space.
So where have you set up your studios over the past 20 years?
Oh, so my first studio, I mean, I started at RISD in Providence, you know, the common studio that we used in school. Then I did my master's in the UK, in the heart of the potteries there at Staffordshire University, which is just next door to Royal Dalton and Wedgwood. You know, it's where they would actually train people to go into the industry. And that my second studio was there. And then I moved to London shortly. I was working for an artist there, and I, was able to use his studio when I had free time. Then I moved to Austria, then to Switzerland, Geneva and Neuchâtel, and then to Oosterwijk, where there is European Ceramic Work Center, a quite famous ceramic residency in the Netherlands, where mainly people who don't work with clay come and work with clay, experiment with clay. I've been there 3 times. One of them was actually for a year. It's dubbed the Clay Convent. It's a very interesting place. It's, they give you a tiny room. It looks like a convent, with very basic amenities, but they give you a huge studio. And there is not much to do in the town, so you just end up working a lot. So that's very immersive experience. And from there, I moved to Amsterdam, where my studio was in my living room. And then I moved to Leiden. And in the same building, actually, in the last 4 years, I moved to 3 different studios, starting with a smaller one, then a bigger and a bigger. But the photographer who just did the last photo shoot part, he actually asked me, so your plan is to what, take over the whole building? Because every time he comes to shoot, it's a different, a bigger studio. But I think I'm okay where I am now for a while.
It's fantastic. Can we look at some of the work now, Caroline? That's wonderful. So Bob, would you like to just talk briefly about this particular piece as we start?
Okay, again, looking at this piece and the others that will follow, the question I would, or the idea that I would like to explore with Ipek here is that when we think of porcelain, of course, we think of a white body, usually, and presumably in your case, composed of the 2 basic porcelain clays, the kaolin and the patoons. Now that yields a white body, as we see here. Could we go to the next slide, please? But you also have so-called black porcelain, as we see in the exposed body of this piece. Now, because it's porcelain, I presume it's still the same basic 2 porcelain clays, kaolin and patoons, to which you must have added a coloring agent, so that it's still at its heart white porcelain through and through. No, I mean, it's white porcelain, but you have added a coloring agent, so it's black through and through, but it's still porcelain. Could you tell us about how you decided to use black porcelain? I know some other potters who do that, but it's relatively rare because we usually see the white porcelain. And tell us your thoughts about black porcelain, how you color it black, and the aesthetics as you see it behind such pieces, and how you view the differences between black and white pieces. Do you use the same glazes, different glazes, some overlap? Those kinds of questions about relationship in your mind between black and white porcelain.
Sure. I started working with porcelain in, I think, 2008, and absolutely fell in love with it. The first time. It was love at first, first touch. It's just an extremely sensual and beautiful material, really fine, really sensitive, and also it's actually less forgiving, more capricious, and a friend of mine likes to call it, it's a diva material that really tests your love for it at all times. It wants to crack, it wants to flop, it wants to collapse. It's a very finicky material, which means you have to be really present at all times, which I think was really actually helpful. What I forgot to mention before was, even though I struggled with eating disorders for 17 years and depression. Once I found ceramics, once I found my calling, my true calling, it gave me the strength to actually heal. Within, I think, once I realized, okay, I love this so much, I can't afford to be weak, not get out of bed in the morning. I can't afford to not have energy, because I found something I really love, and I was 30 at the time, which meant I don't have that much time to, I have less time than my peers to go into it. So I have to do this really fast. So that gave me the strength to actually really find a way to heal. And after 17 years of, struggling with this, within a year of starting working with clay, I healed completely. So it was the love of this material that, gave me a second lease in life. And it was the beauty of the material that also made me want to hang on to it. So with porcelain, a lot of potters or a lot of artists like the translucency. For me, it was actually the touch. It was such a beautiful, incredible feeling. And it was so healing for me to basically love something so much that I wanted to get better. So for me, it wasn't the translucency that got me hooked, but it was the feeling of it. So that's also why I like to leave the outside footless. Actually, that's also one thing that I do differently than most other potters. I don't care for a foot ring because I think it takes away from the flawlessness. If you pick up, I always encourage people to pick up my work. I say, pick it up, touch it, feel the weight, feel the balance, touch the rim, touch the back, the bottom part, and, feel the weight. I like them to be robust. I like them to be strong. They're not so fragile. And they're also friendlier. So instead of if you're not interested in translucency in porcelain, but you're more interested in texture, then I think the whole leaving the outside is it really lends itself to that. So a lot of times when people see my work, even from pictures, they say, it just invites me to touch it. And that's exactly what I want to achieve with the work. They're as much made to be touched and petted and caressed as to be looked at. And since I don't care for translucency, then it's the black was actually the natural next step for me after working with the whites, because I felt like I've been working with members of the same family. My work has been, has a very, very distinct look. But it felt like this year, one, it was the biggest show on my, career yet, 50 pieces. And two, I felt like, okay, it's been, 12 years of working with the white porcelain, with this form. Now, not only do I want to, explore different forms, branch out a little bit and play around, be more playful, as opposed to, and also risk, basically, risk imperfection or risk failures. Because with porcelain, so many things can go wrong. That's why a lot of potters tend to find something that works for them and then explore small variations little by little, because every time you change something, you're risking cracking, you're risking something going wrong, whether it's the glaze or the clay body not being a good fit with the glaze. So this time when Bernie challenged me to make, well, how about 50 pieces instead of 25? I thought, okay, you know what, let's do it. And not only that, but this will actually be a good thing for me, because it'll give me room for improvement, playfulness, experimentation, and also failure. 50 meant even if a lot of them crack and don't make it, I'll still end up with hopefully 25 really good pieces. And the black porcelain just came out of that. I worked with a darker stoneware earlier in 2010, 12, but it wasn't quite as fine. And when I saw that there was a porcelain available that was black, I was like, yeah, okay, let me try this. And that was definitely challenging because a lot of my glazes didn't work well. When it's so it's actually through and through. I don't make I don't add it in. I actually buy the clay black, the porcelain black as it's made that way. But what I do is I put a white liner and underglaze on the inside of the pieces so that the glazes don't get eaten up by the darkness, so that there's still a nice contrast between the outside, but it's inverted. This time the inside is colorful and the outside is dark. So there's still a contrast, but it's a little bit different. And I'd like to say just, one thing about the inside out thing. I always feel like pots, they're quite similar, like people, they look, very similar to each other, but you only get to see the differences when you get up close and personal. And people are like that too. I'm very much a people person. I love getting to know people, and that one makes tick. Sorry.
No, there was an echo, I think. Let me just ask between, Carolyn, if you don't mind going back to the previous slide as well, talking simply not about thank you, not about the difference between black and white porcelain and how you ended up there. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that you were willing to expand your vocabulary in terms of forms, but to talk about these two forms, one where you have the rounded lip coming and defining the interior, but all in white, and the other with the three levels essentially defined on the outside of the black and then the inside, which is not as typical of the work that we originally received from you, but it adds a dimension of absolute difference. And then having a show means that people can actually go from piece to piece, pick up pieces and feel and see the differences. So if you talk about the differences in the forms themselves from your perspective.
Yeah, in between these two forms, you mean with this one and the other one? Yeah.
Yes.
That form actually came out of it's simply after I dry the pieces and they're bisque fired and sanded, I tend to stack them simply to save space on the shelves. It will be not economical space wise to have the pieces not stacking. So sometimes I just look at all these pieces that are stacked of similar sizes, and I'm like, oh, that actually would make a nice form. So the one that you're seeing with the black porcelain simply came out of that, because I would just once in a while look at the shop and like, that's actually a nice form. Why didn't I do that? So that's how that's where it came from. And people ask me, why I don't do slip casting, because my forms look like they work well with slip casting, but in fact, I did 2 years of slip casting when I did the ceramic design program because it was very industrial. I wasn't even allowed to throw. But with working with molds or slip casting, the thickness of the wall has to be absolutely even simply by the nature of the process. Whereas I'm really interested in one, flawlessness, because if you do slip casting, you have to have a seam line, which I would hate. And two, I would have to have, I would be forced to be okay with the same thickness across, the cross section. Whereas I really enjoy difference. It's a little bit thinner here, then it gets a little bit thicker. It's really thicker here, and there's actually even here there's a little dip, so it never wobbles. And then there's a little bit of this, so that the bottom is always a little bit like that, allowing the glaze to pool and creating that that thing. When the glaze pools, the glaze thickness determines the texture really. So when I do a little bit of curve like this as opposed to coming down and being flat, that allows the glaze to do something really cool. So with slip casting, I'd never be able to do that, but that's basically the main difference between these. It's the black one is almost like 3 pieces stacked on top of each other.
Right. Bob, would you respond to the same question from your perspective as a curator looking at these 3 forms? The first one, the white sides coming in on it, and then the next slide, Caroline, that we can look at as well, the ripples, essentially the 3 layers that Ipek talked about.
Yes, they're wonderful forms. As I mentioned before, the unglazed exterior, whether it's black or whether it's white, really acts as something of a frame to showcase the beautiful glaze within. But slip casting would, it's a very efficient way to produce tableware for everyday use and things like that. But slip casting is not really appropriate for producing, for the most part, producing works of art like the fine porcelains that Ipek has created and is exhibiting here. And I think that it is wonderful to have the thick walls more evident in the previous slide. Caroline, if you want to go back one slide. Yes, the thick wall that you see here, it showcases the beautiful unglazed, highly buffed, and I say buffed as opposed to polished. One could use polish, but polish often implies that there's a luster. This is a matte finish, and so perhaps buff is a better word. But when you touch them, they are absolutely smooth, inviting to the touch, and one sort of feels that one is touching satin as opposed to unglazed ceramic ware. But going back to the ceramic body, the porcelain body, two quick questions for Ipek. You mentioned that you buy the porcelain clay, and you buy the white clay, you buy the black clay, so it's already prepared and ready to go. Have you ever experimented with preparing your own porcelain clay, starting with kale and patoons, purifying them, mixing them together to get the right mixture? I know you don't produce your pots that way, but I just wonder if you've experimented with that. And number two, even with the clay that you purchased, do you have to do much purification or a lot of working to make sure that there are no air bubbles in the clay and things like that, which certainly would cause all kinds of distortions and warts and whatever you want to call it that would occur if you didn't work out the air bubbles before firing. So those two questions about the clay. Oh dear, Ipek's disappeared. I asked the wrong questions.
No. Oh, really? Well,
Some technical issue.
yeah, on her end. So let's move on.
While we're waiting for
Yeah.
Ipek to come back, I would just say some of the things that I was interested in. This kind of brown glaze with a metallic sheen relates to wares used in Chinese brown and black glazed wares, called, often referred to by the Japanese name temmoku, which is a traditional colorant, a glazed colorant, coming from iron. Move on to the next one, please, Carolyn.
Hi.
And in using iron,
Sorry about
you
that.
can, we'll come, as soon as I finish this, we'll go right back to you, Ipek, so you can respond. But I was just trying to do something while you were away for a second. When you use iron, there are a couple of different compounds of iron. There's Fe3O4, Fe2O3, using different oxides of iron, even though it's still iron. Different oxides of iron produce slightly different results, and also the quantity of the iron oxide added to the glaze. So even with the same colorant that is an oxide of iron, such as this one or the previous one, you can get a brown or black glaze with very different surface effects to the glaze. Now, back to Ipek to continue what we were discussing before.
Yeah, sorry about that technical issue. So that is actually making my own porcelain will be absolutely the next step. I've already started modifying my my porcelain. Sometimes I work with stoneware, also modifying that, mainly because with large pieces, the survival rates, meaning no crack rate, is actually 1 to 2 in 10. I mean, that's such, if you think about the amount of time and energy I have to spend on the pieces, it's such a waste of time and energy to not actually, really go after this to try to fix the cracking issue. And to do that, I've tried, switching from porcelain to stoneware. I've also tried working with a mix of porcelain and stoneware. And then I've experimented with adding malachite. Malachite is simply porcelain fired up to top temperature and then ground up to become like flour. And then you can add that to the porcelain body when you make a slip. Slip is basically liquid clay. So I've actually done that with different percentages, tried 20%, 30%, 40% of malachite. But that unfortunately changes the openness of the clay body. So it's the glazes stop working as well. So that would mean if I add a lot of malachite, I have to then start creating a whole other set of glazes. And I'm trying to find a way not to do that. So, but I think eventually I will actually make my own clay. It's a lot of, I've talked to a lot of experts. They seem to tell me, they seem to all be telling me that I would actually have a better rate of survival for the big pieces if I made my own clay, so that it's basically formulated to do exactly what I needed to do, which is survive high temperature firing, and in large format. Yeah, so I don't at the moment make my own porcelain, and simply because it would take a lot of time, and I'm not really an expert in this. So I keep, I continue to work with Audrey Blackman Porcelain, but I think that's the next step, really. Yeah.
So let's move on to these two, no, not that far, back to the two Temoku pieces that Bob began speaking about. And just briefly from your perspective, to talk about what you feel are the elements of both of them that meant that you didn't break them and they didn't break.
Could you say that again, please? These two pieces?
I didn't really have a question about these two pieces when I was speaking. My point was simply moving from the body to talk a little bit about the glazes, is that some of Ipek's glazes recall classic glazes, particularly classic glazes in China, such as the brown or black glaze that we see here, that is often goes by the Japanese name Temmoku, or hare's fur. It's simply a glaze it's related to a celadon glaze, because celadon is also uses iron oxide as a colorant, but increasing the amount of iron oxide in the glaze, it shifts from a pale bluish green celadon to a brown or black glaze, as we're seeing here. And then the markings on the surface, at least in traditional Chinese ceramics and Chinese teawares from the Song dynasty, the markings on the surface result either from the application of a little bit of slip, iron-bearing slip on the surface, or from saturation of the glaze with the coloring agent, such that it segregates itself out, the coloring agent segregates itself out on the surface during the cooling process. The next slide, please, Carolyn. There. I don't know exactly how Ipek produced this, but in a Chinese Temoku bowl, this would have resulted from saturating the glaze with the iron oxide coloring agent, such that the glaze can't hold any more of the iron oxide, and it segregates itself out and forms the beautiful silvery metallic sheen on the surface. Now, Ipek may have produced it a different way, but that's the way the Chinese would have done that in the Song dynasty.
Ipek, do you want to talk about the two pieces?
Yeah, it's so this glaze I actually started to work with in 2008, and similar to the love at first touch, this was definitely love at first sight. I even remember the particular piece, like the first piece that came out of the kiln with this glaze. It's a high metallic glaze. It's got a lot of manganese in it, and I just remember looking at this piece thinking, oh my God, this is incredible. It was, it had these tiny, teeny little, like silvery crystals and this silky matte, brown, like it was just this gorgeous color, but also texture. It was silky smooth, and the crystals were slightly shiny, and they looked like tiny, teeny little stars that someone just sprinkled inside. And so I fell in love with this glaze, and I started working with it in 2008, and I'm still in love with it. So I have a lot of variations of it. Over the years, I think I made over 45 variations of this glaze. And sometimes the little variations are as little as simply changing using the same formula, but the same ingredients, but changing the proportions just to experiment. And sometimes it's actually buying the same materials, for example, manganese or iron, but from different mines, different suppliers that come from different countries. Even that can actually change the outcome. So I have a lot of different bronze glazes, simply because the proportions of the material, the glaze is different, what the ingredients, and also the same material. For example, a few years ago, I had this awful problem with this glaze where I wasn't getting the crystals. I mean, I had moved also from Switzerland to the Netherlands, and I thought, oh, maybe it's the water, because you can change little things in an ingredient and it will create different results. So I thought maybe the water is harder here, more calcium, less calcium, but I was going crazy. I just couldn't get the crystals to work anymore. And then I ran out of one of the ingredients, copper, in this glaze. And then I had to order a new one. And when I ordered when the new delivery arrived, it just looked like the copper looked like a different green, but it's sold under the same name, copper carbonate. So then I asked the company, and I sent the batch number of the old, and I said, "Are you sure there is not a mistake here? Because for 3 years I've been using this lighter green one." I said, "No, they're both copper carbonate, but it's just slightly different. It should work the same way." And it was just mind blown. I realized simply because it came from a different supplier, different mine, it actually, even though it's the same molecular, it's the same material, it actually acts differently. And I knew this. That's why I was always playing around with getting, red clay for a glaze from, I don't know, Westerwald in Germany or UK, or different kinds of manganese from different countries. But that really made me understand this is insane. If you like a glaze, you have to buy a lot of the material so that they last you a lifetime. And I just love this glaze. It's because these two pieces are very similar in glaze formula. They're actually, fired in the same way, but they produce very different crystals, and it's just lovely. It's like having a conversation with the same person, but at different times. And then you find out something different, because the glaze formula is very similar. The firing is the same, but you just get different results, and it's lovely.
It is indeed. And for people who are able to visit the gallery, the opportunity both to look at them and to hold them, also the realization that they are very different visual and personal experiences. Let's move to the next image if we could, because here from the Temuku in the dark, you have this very beautiful crystalline glaze with the crackles in it. And there's a sense of visual purity to this in these two pieces, and also the shape itself has a kind of delicacy. The walls don't seem to be as thick. The lip around it is more open. There's a sort of generosity and invitation to simply become part of it.
I love that you say generosity, actually, because when I was still in school, studying art and deciding to, trying to decide what shape or what form, what object I should focus on, I realized a lot of the artists, I really loved, Rothko or Pierre Soulages, or just different artists, or Agnes Martin, huge fan, Martin Klein. What I really liked, or Andy Goldsworthy, Georgia O'Keeffe, these are all, or Chuck Close, I can't, I'll stop. These are all the artists who've given, decades of their career to something similar, exploring freedom and restriction. And that's something I can relate to. I also find, like them, freedom and restriction. So I wanted to, when I was first starting out, commit myself to one material, clay, and also commit myself to a form or an object that would be meaningful to me, because I think art is searching for a meaning, or trying to find meaning or express meaning. And so I thought, okay, well, I want to be like these artists, like I admire so much, people who, with something specific, whether it's nature or gestural painting or lines. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do? And again, going back to my childhood and my origin, I realized, well, Turkey is absolutely full of, if you like, sightseeing and historical archaeology, and I love archaeology. I thought, wait a minute, there's something really common in all these different cultures. Wherever you go in the world, if you go to an archaeological site, you'll always find a bowl. And growing up as a child in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of, in Turkey, polarization. It was, men and women had to live by different rules. It was still, back then, a more secular country than it is now, but my brother and I had different rules we had to live by, and there were polarization. You heard about the Kurdish Turkish problem, and there was an otherness there. You felt it a lot in society, and I didn't like that. As a very sensitive kid, I thought everybody should get along, and I didn't understand why we had to have wars. And there was also, Pol Pot, just Cambodia, awful things happening around Iraq. And I thought, okay, well, humanity is at the same time beautiful and tough to each other. But if I want to create meaning, then I need to focus on the good things. And the good things were, they were good things, they were common things, you know, and the bowl form, I felt like, wow, not only do you find in a lot of different countries, but also it goes back to 30,000 years. One of the oldest forms, you know, humans made, a form that we still use today. And whether whether the ancient Egypt put organs inside, you know, after someone died to preserve them, or whether we share, you know, a drink together, or, you know, something that you offer to someone when they come to visit your house in Turkey. It's, you know, it's very common, you know, when someone comes to visit, you offer them something sweet, but it's always in a bowl. So that shape, but to me, was really important. And to the generosity, again, I thought like generosity, preserving, safekeeping, these are all really positive aspects of humanness. And so that's why I chose this form. And this particular shape to me is the embodiment of that continuity and on the positive, the positive elements of, you know, human DNA, sharing, generosity. So it's yeah, I really like that you saw that in this piece. It's very open.
Bob, if you'd comment on this and the next piece together or separately. So Caroline, let's look at the next one as well, and then go back and forth. And I like your perspective on the two pieces.
Okay, going back to the previous one, Caroline, this one, is this a celadon glaze, Ipek, colored by iron oxide, or is this a completely different glaze?
It's actually not, but I when I first started working, I absolutely loved reduction firing, because the alchemy really showed up even more than in oxidation firings. You would put, you know, a material that was just like a green powder, and it would come out oxblood red.
That would be from copper. That would be from copper.
Yeah, that would be from copper indeed. But I don't have so I love celadon glazes and oxbloods. You know, I love the ancient glazes, but I have to work with an electric kiln now, so I needed to figure out another way of dealing with it. So basically, I take you know, a high nepheline cyanide glaze, which is, you know, it has a very nice crackle to it, and simply learn to be okay with adding a stain, a pigment, instead of iron, because the iron would look different if I added it to this. And also I've tried copper, which simply because I love working with raw materials, natural materials, more than pigments. So I tried copper, but it bubbled a lot. So for some reason, copper didn't work with this high nepheline cyanide glaze. And then, you know, I thought about it. Can I work with a pigment? You know, is it okay? Is it cheating? And I just decided to get over myself and work with a pigment. So this is basically for me pigment number 8.
So
But
it coincidentally
I try a lot of percentages to figure out the right one. And this one is cobalt. It's
yes, this is a very traditional coloring agent. We see it in China, Korea, Japan, Europe. But even though we see it on porcelain, even on earthenware in China in the 8th century, we see cobalt glazes. And so it is used in many cultures, but you have used it so beautifully. It's a very rich, vibrant royal blue, as we see here, and where the glaze is a little bit thicker at the center of the bowl, where it pools during firing. Of course, it appears darker. But even though cobalt is a glaze coloring agent used around the world, you have perfected it in a way that few other cultures have, so that it's just stunningly beautiful. Congratulations. This is one of my favorite pieces.
Thank you.
Extraordinarily beautiful with that beautiful blue glaze.
Thank you. It's actually a beautiful purplish blue, actually. It's quite nice, because cobalt tends to be very dark, like navy blue. And I had to find the right percentage. So I experiment a lot. And when I was working with cobalt, I went from 0.015% to 2.5. And 2.5 gave me almost black. And I really wanted this nice blue. So I had to find a percentage, you know, somewhere in the middle between those two. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a really nice, deep, rich, purpley blue.
It is. You've certainly mastered the technique of cobalt. Now, the next slide, Caroline.
There you
Now,
go.
some of the glazes, like the brown glaze with the silvery sheen or cobalt, those use very traditional glaze coloring agents. As I mentioned, the Chinese have used them for 1,000 years. But this is a very different glaze. This is also a high-fired glaze, is it?
Yeah,
Yes.
this one is 1220, I think. Yeah, or 1220, somewhere between that and 1250, because depending on where it is in the kiln, it could change. But yeah,
So
it's a high fire.
This was fired during the primary porcelain firing.
Yeah, got glaze fire. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is quite revolutionary. I mean, many cultures produce a sort of orange red or cinnabar red glaze, as we see here. But in most cases, when we see this color on a Chinese ceramic, it is an overglaze enamel that is applied to the surface of an already fired glazed porcelain and then refired at a lower temperature to mature the enamel, to bring forth its color, and also to fuse it to the glazed surface. I think this is a very rare glaze color in the family of high-fired glazes, and I would be excited to hear you explain something about this glaze, because to my again, I don't work that much with Western ceramics, European or contemporary ceramics, but in my experience, this is quite revolutionary, and I would love to hear you talk about it.
Well, I hope I won't disappoint you when I say this too was colored by a pigment. And it's because like I said, I do love oxbloods and reds in general, but because I don't have a gas firing kiln, I have to, reinvent some things and find ways to go around issues, circumvent problems and limitations. And I because I work with really generally earthy colors, whether it's bodies of water, colors of that are related to icebergs and rivers and or earth, like the bronze ones. I once in a while I like to have a little splash of color in a collection, or once in a while I like to have something that's a little bit different, just as pops. And red is a really lovely color, so I didn't want it to be glossy, so I basically took one of my base glazes, which I like to use to to experiment with colors and pigments and raw oxides, like raw colorants like barium or lithium or spodumene, which create beautiful blues. Or copper is one of my absolute favorite colors because it's so versatile. This one is actually a red pigment, but it's on a matte, silky matte base glaze, and I had to fire this I think 2 or 3 times because the red was a little bit on the too thin side, so I wanted it rich. So I reglazed and refired, reglazed, refired, until I actually got this little white crystals in when they pooled. So this piece is I think quite lovely, mainly because of the white crystals inside the red. It breaks that that uniformity a little bit and creates a little sparkle there in the middle.
Right, that's terrific. It's a new glaze color, if you will, at least in my experience. The Chinese had perfected the copper red glaze in the, as you mentioned, in the so-called oxblood glazes, which the Chinese say the ideal color in the copper red glazes, from their perspective, is the color of crushed strawberries, which we would probably say the color of strawberry jam or something like that. And they perfected that. So, but you have done something different rather than just following what the Chinese did. This is a more orange-red glaze instead of a strawberry jam glaze. And I think it's quite new, exciting, and absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
Not to mention unique.
Even better. So it's an opportunity to move on to the next one, which is a blue glaze, and giving people a nice option to go from red to blue and back.
Right, and here I would just be interested in Ipek's. These are quite different glazes, some of them crystalline, and just hear Ipek's discussion of how she creates them, why she likes them, what she considers special about them.
Thank you. So I really, this is actually one of my favorite pieces ever, and one of my favorite pieces in the show. It's just overall, it's it's got a very soft shape and then the soft rim, but a very sharp rim on the inside. So there's something really delicious about it. someone saw this piece and said, if Apple, the brand made pots, they would look like this. I love that flawlessness of this piece, and the glaze. I'm looking at the recipe now. So it's also potash feldspar, lithium, strontium. So lithium and strontium really help create beautiful blues. I mean, really breathtaking blues. So the feldspar creates the crackles, and also this one has a little bit of copper in it. Again, one of my absolutely favorite colorants, because copper, you can get anything from a very, very slight green to turquoise to beige to even black with copper, depending on the reaction in the glaze with the other materials, the firing, oxidation or reduction, or the percentage. And this one has ever so slight amounts of these colorants. But yeah, I think I also find it is an absolutely beautiful, almost like a tropical sea color.
Wonderful.
Beautiful.
Yep, you're absolutely right, Bob. I'm going to move on to the next couple and get some responses, because these manifest differently with the dark outside and the glorious explosion inside.
Yeah, this is actually interesting because this is the same exact glaze as the piece that we looked at before just now. So I mean, that's one of the things I love about glazes and glaze chemistry and ceramics. It's, it constantly keeps you on your toes. You always have to learn new things. So when this piece came out of the kiln the first time, I thought, oh, really? That's not what I was expecting. And I was really disappointed. And I even thought about, okay, well, this is definitely going in the trash. And then a little voice in me said, oh, keep it. So I decided to, sometimes I do that. Sometimes if I don't like a piece immediately, I say, okay, well, I'll just live with it for a while, put it aside, and then, just sort of like look at it with the corner of my eye as I pass it, in the studio, I'll see if it grows on me. And in a few days, this piece started to grow on me. And then I actually ended up loving it, because the middle is like a little heart, and it's a deep, rich, tropical jungle green, like emerald green, but it's also a crackle. And so I decided to keep it. I'm really glad, because it gave me the jumping point to experiment with bigger pieces and different pieces. And then I realized I actually really quite love this glaze. So the green is happening simply because of the underlining underglaze. If you put that blue glaze, the one that we were looking at in the preceding slide, this one, because I tried this on the black porcelain, knowing it won't look the same, but I was just open to seeing what it will look like, and you couldn't really tell the blue. It just ended up being a glossy crackle. So then I decided, okay, I'm going to put a white liner, and then put the glaze on top of that, and then I got this incredibly beautiful Amazon green emerald crackle glaze. It's so nice. I want to jump in there when I see this glaze.
And the next one is actually not a ceramic.
Yeah, I collect images of nature because it's always where I draw inspiration from. I love tropical beaches, sand, earthy, cracked earth pictures, different bodies of water, whether it's cold iceberg, or the sky, and or even dew. I love dew pictures. And then I started getting into these blue holes in different places, the Bahamas and Belize. And I look at these images once in a while, whether it's once a week or once a month or sometimes every day, if I'm trying to channel different glazes and let them sort of like distill in my mind and then trickle into the glaze formula. So I think the green glaze is simply, because I was looking at this picture a lot, it just came.
And then produce the next piece that we'll look at.
Yeah.
Not quite, but nonetheless, it gives that same notion of this explosion in the center, and then the residue of it creating a wonderful embrace of it. Bob, do you want to speak briefly about this?
Yes, it looks like something out of the heavens, for example, a a white dwarf star exploding or something like that. It's an absolutely beautiful piece. And to realize that it's the same glaze throughout, that depending on the thickness and depending on how components within the glaze migrate to different places as the glaze melts during firing. It's just wonderful to see how the same basic formula can produce such varied effects in the heat and atmosphere of the kiln.
Yeah.
I do have one question for Ipek, and then would love to hear her comments on this. Now, this obviously has a white liner. It's black porcelain, and you have coated the interior with the white liner. The glaze would look very different against a black porcelain background, maybe even different colors, I don't know, but it would look very different if the white liner weren't there. I would just like to know, what is the white liner? Is it simply a white slip that you apply to the interior of the vessel, let it dry completely, and then apply the glaze? It's a white slip, is that right?
It's actually an underglaze, so it, you know,
Oh, it's an underglaze as
it's
opposed
more
to
than
a slip.
yeah, it's more than a slip. It's supposed to really stick to it. So actually, what I do is I make the piece, let it dry, biscuit, sand it, and then I apply the underglaze. I spray it actually so that it's nice and uniform, and then clean it, and then it biscuit again. So these pieces, the black ones, are biscuit twice, because I actually tried putting the underglaze on before the bisque, but then the piece is actually quite brittle. Not only brittle, but the underglaze sticks to the black, and because I try to have contrast, I end up wet sponging the piece on the outside, but it only smears the white. So then I figured out it's actually better to bisque the piece, make it harder, and then easier to clean. Then after the bisque fire, apply the underglaze, clean it with a wet sponge, really clean it if I need to sand it, and then bisque it, and then glaze it. Just, I figured out that's actually the best way. But it's more than just white slip.
Right, and so the white underglaze is actually white, and it is opaque, or is it
very opaque.
translucent?
Yeah, it's completely opaque. Yeah,
it's completely opaque. Yeah, it would
yeah.
have to be to get the right background so that the interior of the pot can serve as a canvas for your glaze, so to speak.
Yeah, what's interesting though, it's again, like going back to the mystery of glazes, and I have a tiny little note on this. The Turkish word for glaze is actually the same word for mystery or secret. And I think it's absolutely lovely, because you really don't know what you're gonna get, and glazes are very mysterious. So even though this is a blue glaze, blue crackle glaze on the white porcelain, it becomes this emerald green on the black one with the white liner. Not only that, but if we look at another one of my black pieces, black porcelain pieces with the white crackle glaze, only white, that one doesn't have this variation of like the black and these sort of waves or foresty look. Interestingly, this glaze pulls parts of that underglaze, so that in parts you see the black porcelain comes through, and in parts there's a bit of it's absolutely wild. I can't explain why it does this, but this glaze pulls parts of the white underglaze, and causing the black porcelain to show through the glaze. It's just really interesting.
It's also important for people, if you did or if did not, we'll send you the e-catalog to note the scale of this. So this is 12 inches. Some of the other pieces that we have looked at are more like 4, 6, and 8 inches. So the scale of this is also impressive in person, that I invite you to see. And we're going to look at the last slide. And this is a considerably smaller piece, 4 3/4 inches. But again, the issue of scale, of weight, of form, and obviously of glaze are all relevant to the care with which you've made them, but also the care with which others are invited to see them. So just talk briefly about both of these, both you, Ipek, and then Bob.
So with this piece, I was just looking at the glaze recipe here. Yeah, this is a mainly potash feldspar, some spodumene, and strontium. Strontium is it does make beautiful blues, and a little bit, of course, copper carbonate, my favorite. And on the inside, so it's rare for me actually to glaze the inside and outside, but for some reason with this piece, I felt like, okay, I need to glaze also the inside and do something a little bit different there, because the black porcelain, when you fire it high, it can look a little bit brown. Not, and I really wanted a good contrast between the glaze on the outside and the interior. So because the glaze on the outside again has that white underglaze to really make it pop, and the inside glaze is actually 20% of one glaze, one of my favorite blue shimmery blues, and 80% of my bronze glaze. So apart from trying new formulas, I also like to try different proportions of my regular glazes, just to see if I can increase the repertoire simply by combining glazes. So the inside is this is a combination of my bronze and a shimmery blue, which becomes actually a shimmery black. Yeah, and I love the outside where it looks like tiny little craters, like the surface of the moon. The form is inspired by actually copper cauldrons that they used to use in the 1800s in Ottoman Empire. They would have these huge cauldrons where they would serve food, or they would either use to cook food in or serve from. Yeah, I just thought it would be a nice variation, to my bowl shape.
And Bob, please.
Yes, I think it's a wonderful piece. The shape is robust, if you will, and it emanates energy, and also a very beautiful glaze, both the dark glaze on the interior and the beautiful pale blue glaze on the exterior. I was going to ask, but you've already explained about the interior, because as soon as I saw it, I thought black porcelain would not have a luster. So my first reaction was, apart from the beauty of the piece, was that you must have glazed the interior. And you've answered the question that it has sort of a pale blue glaze plus iron, as in the brown glazes. And so you've answered that question. It's a very effective combination. And you're right that with the glazed exterior, it's nice to have a bit of glaze on the interior, so there's a slight bit of luster rather than just matte black. Now, the underside of the piece, we only see down to the edge, but not where it constricts. I assume that when we move below the lower edge of the blue glaze here, it is unglazed black porcelain. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Shape goes like this, and then there's actually a roundish bottom. Again, no foot ring, and it's unglazed. Yeah.
And because it's unglazed, you don't have to worry about firing supports or anything like that. It can simply sit on the kiln furniture. Yes.
Yeah, though with porcelain, you end up with something called plucking. Porcelain tends to fuse to the glaze shelf. The kiln shelf, unless it's some aluminum or sand. So with porcelain, especially, also with stoneware, but with porcelain, I have to put some aluminum or kiln wash, something that will ever so slightly prevent full contact with the kiln shelf, because I've had pieces actually get stuck on the kiln shelf, and when I would lift them, they would chip a little bit, leaving a part of the pot on the kiln shelf.
And when you say aluminum, something like that, do you mean something as thin as aluminum foil, or do you mean a little tiny aluminum stand?
Aluminum is a very high refractory material that can withstand very high temperatures. So alumina powder is basically.
Oh, so you put it on as a powder. Yes, that makes complete sense. And talking about the firing this and that, I could see in the background of the little video that we showed at the beginning of your talk that there is a cylindrical electric kiln in your studio. I presume you fire all of these in an electric kiln. In a studio setting in a city, of course, you couldn't use a wood-fired kiln, obviously, and gas firing can be somewhat dangerous. So an electric kiln is very practical from that fire prevention point of view. At the same time, with the electric kiln, I think you probably have the best facilities for controlling the temperature, the firing temperature, and the kiln atmosphere. Is that right? So for many reasons, I can guess that you use an electric kiln.
Yes, so I have two electric kilns, a 60-liter one and a 180-liter one, and there are pros and cons. I mean, I actually started firing. My love of ceramics started one at Rizzi, and then eventually also when I had first started working in a private studio, we had a gas firing kiln. But because I make large pieces and because it's porcelain, it means I have to go up very slowly. I have to go down very slowly.
Yes.
And that basically means sometimes the firings are 3-4 days. And so basically when I was working with the gas kiln, that meant I had to be up 2-3 days, at least 4 days sometimes, going and, changing, because it was not an automatic kiln, which meant I had to change the, the amount of gas so that I could increase the temperature of the kiln and then eventually lower it by hand. It's after doing this, for 2 years, about every, like, let's say 6 months, because it was a big kiln, I realized I just can't. It's, it's very taxing on the body. I mean, ceramics generally is hard work if you're working with, large pieces. And the largest piece I've ever made was actually 40 kilos, which is more than 80, I think probably about 90 pounds of clay. That's very taxing on the body also. So I figured something's got to give. I can't be using my body like that, abusing it almost, to make pieces that big. And then on top of that, stay sleepless for, days and days and days. So it was simply a practical decision to, use my energy and time more economically. With an electric kiln, it's a couple of things. They come with controllers, and gas kilns do too, but they cost a lot more. So with electric kilns, you can control it. And I have a very good controller. So it means it's got like, 10-20 steps, which means I can really, map out the way up and then the ramp, and the way down, the cooling, the dwelling, everything. With a gas kiln, you have to do that all manually. And I thought, same thing with, in the beginning, it felt like, oh, electric kiln is cheating. Being a purist, but eventually I just decided to get over myself. Same thing as using in pigments. It was a difficult decision because I'm so much of a purist that I thought, oh, I only have to work with materials that come as they are from the earth and are, minimally refined. So only copper or manganese or, iron, for example. But eventually I realized, wait a minute, I'm an artist and I should be able to be more free, just, So then I thought, okay, I'm an artist, I'm allowed to work with, pigments that are manufactured. And the whole electric kiln decision also was an extension of that. Eventually, I realized, okay, I need to make my life a little bit easier, because it's difficult enough. And electric kilns are just so much easier to work with. You don't have to stay sleepless for, for weeks every year. They're wonderful for that.
So
and of course, with your very thick-walled pieces, you have to increase the temperature slowly. You have to cool the pieces slowly. So you need lest they crack, split, warp, or something worse.
Yeah.
So you need a very, very good control over the kiln. And I would just have one last question, probably pretty quick. Do you fire most of your pieces one by one in the kiln, or do you fire multiple pieces in the kiln?
Always multiples. I mean, it's
Yeah, I
to
would
save
think so.
time and
For
energy.
efficient
and
use of time and energy, yes.
yeah. It's mainly, saving energy and being more efficient, financially and energy wise. And also the kilns are big enough. Even I can't fire my bigger pieces in my small kiln, the 60-liter one, but I can fire, I mean, on a shelf, any given shelf, I actually, a lot of times with the big ones, I can only fit one in the bigger kiln. So every shelf, most of the time when I work with big pieces, has one piece. But there I can do, like, I think when I was working for the show, the most amount of pieces I could fit when I was working with big ones was 3 or 4 pieces in the kiln. So even though it's multiples, it's still very small amount of pieces I can fit inside my kilns. One day I'd like to have a bigger studio with a bigger kiln, but at the moment, I do what I can with what I have. So that means, 3 to 4 big pieces in a kiln, in a firing.
So let me conclude. First of all, you talked about the efficiency and time, and a small apology to all who thought they were tuning in for an hour and they got much more, for which I'm very grateful. A lot of very good and meaningful information, and also a good deal of appreciation, and hopefully guides as to how more carefully to look at your work, Ipek, but also to look at art in general. The vast majority of artists that we work with do invest totally of themselves in what they're creating. And it's always rewarding for the work itself to be appreciated by people looking carefully, and hopefully this conversation will help with that. And finally, I just want to add, as I usually do, a quote from Thomas that says, skill and art are not the same thing. And the only real measure of art is astonishment. And I think that's a nice way to think about people who see your work. And Bob certainly has done that beautifully, to feel astonished and grateful for what you have created. So thank you, everyone. Carolyn, thank you so much. And look forward to seeing everybody in person again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.